Hello, Copenhagen. Welcome, everyone. And thanks to Björn. A nice talk there. I think he covered a lot of important points, especially on some of the practical stuff that we're doing to try to make people's lives a bit easier with developing on such a swiftly moving target. I'm not going to talk too much about the short to mid-term stuff. I'm going to use my time today to sort of give people an idea of where I'm thinking Polkadot should probably be heading. I'll start with just sort of discussing briefly what Polkadot sort of is and what state it's in. It's functionally complete in terms of what was originally sort of covered in the paper that I wrote, however long, many years ago, almost 7 years ago now. And the code base release for Polkadot 1.0 is imminent. What is Polkadot 1.0? Well, it's originally I wrote this as scalable, heterogeneous, multi-chain. So it's a blockchain, but it has a particular consensus method, and BABE is what it's called, and it's able to secure other blockchains. It's able to support these other chains that we call parachains. Okay, so far so good. Polkadot parachains, understood. Here is like a very simple artistic impression. I'm the artist. And in the middle there is the relay chain, and it does all sorts of stuff, right? It does this and it does that. It does crowd loans and it does auctions. It manages all the balances and it does all the staking stuff and governance and big relay chain. And these little parachains dotted around, and it kind of helps these guys be secure. All right. Very good. So yeah, the relay chain does quite a lot. And what's provided? Well, security, and also these chains can sort of talk to each other, can send each other messages. Nothing especially surprising here. How does the Polkadot product present itself? Well, it presents itself in terms of these slots, 6 monthly sort of slots that you can get up to 2 years in advance. And there's these crowd loan things. But there's not really any other way of utilizing what Polkadot does. This is the product, right? As it is in Polkadot 1. Now, I think this is quite I didn't actually realize what the correct wording of this quote was until I, actually put it into Google and got the real quote up. But I think it's quite an important one. Basically, it's like a perspective shift is really quite crucial if one is to really understand the world, perhaps more so than just seeing more of the world. And I think it's important to understand what Polkadot is, to have a bit of a perspective shift. This parachains and relay chain thing, it's all very well, and it's how I and many others understood Polkadot in the early days. It's how we modeled what it was that we were building, right? You have to build towards something. This is what we were building towards. But it turns out, as has been the case in the past, with a notable other fairly large project in the crypto space that I was involved with, that when you've built it, you realize you've actually built something a little bit, or even quite different, to what it was that you're originally trying to build. Oftentimes, I mean, if you've sort of gotten maybe a bit lucky, or you've maybe had a great team behind you, or whatever, you can build something quite a lot more sort of fundamentally better than what it was that you were actually attempting to build. Mostly through, the classic things that they teach you in computer science, if you go to a university and have some decent lecturers, about abstraction and generalization. And it turns out that we've abstracted and generalized Polkadot quite a lot beyond what we had originally envisioned. So what's this new perspective, and how is it relevant? Well, the first thing is, Polkadot is, what we have built isn't so much about chains. It's more about space. It's more about the underlying resources that chains need in order for us to deliver this kind of this parachains kind of chatting to each other system. It's also important to understand that Polkadot is ultimately a platform for people to build applications, for users to use those applications. It's not a platform to host, like fundamentally speaking, it's not a platform to host chains. Chains happen to be one of the ways that we get to how Polkadot is useful, but perhaps not the only way. And it's also very crucially resilient. I use the term unstoppable has been sort of bandied about a lot in this industry. I think, not without reason. But I think it's also, it can be a bit of a turn-off to some crowds, like regulators, for example. So, I think a more neutral term is resilience. And it's resilience against sort of anyone or set of people that want to make it do something that was not intended. Yeah? It's resilience to the corruption of intention. So what is, if we look at Polkadot in a much more general sense, what is it? Well, it's a provider of very resilient, general purpose computation. And I say continuation computation, a bit technical, but it's basically like it's not that you have a job and you do the job and then it's done, right? What we actually want to do is have a sort of broad, long-running task that can sort of do some stuff and then kind of pause for a bit and then maybe do some more stuff later on. Broadly speaking, continuations. And in this sense, I'm going to dive back into, I don't know when it was, 2015, 2016, when I sort of had this world computer language. It's a bit like that. I think it's time to sort of reconsider Polkadot in these terms. All right, so if we do reconsider it in these terms, how can we look at Polkadot? Well, it's a computer, like a modern machine. It's a multi-core computer. It's not single core anymore. We now have many different cores. They all operate at the same time, doing different stuff. So far, so good. And it turns out that in this model, blockchains that sort of operate on a core are called parachains. In fact, more specifically, blockchains that kind of have a reserved core to continuously operate on, they're called parachains. All right. So now we understand parachains within this new perspective, this new paradigm. Let's think a bit more about the Polkadot computer. Well, the Polkadot computer, supercomputer, I mean, it's more powerful than a regular computer, probably. It has around 50 cores at the moment. These cores are continuously operating, continuously running, and they're all independent of each other. So they're all going in parallel. And for what it's worth, the original language of parachains sort of came a bit from this, parallelized chains. Now, having done some benchmarking, have an idea for optimizations, and over the course of a few years, models suggest that this can go quite substantially, well into the hundreds. So when we think about what Polkadot is delivering in these terms, it does start to feel more like a serious computational resource. So let's think about these individual cores. We've decided, okay, Polkadot has got many of them. What does each one do? Is it really like a CPU core? Well, actually, yeah, it is. It has a number of characteristics, a number of attributes. You can describe it in quite similar terms to a CPU core, because at the end of the day, it is something that does computation. The bandwidth, so the total amount of data that goes in and out of the core, roughly speaking, is about 1 megabyte a second. In terms of the actual underlying computation power, like how many calculations it can do, we're looking at about a score of about 380 on Geekbench 5, for those who care. And the latency, so essentially the period of time between it doing 2 consecutive chunks of work, is 6 seconds. These, particularly the bandwidth and the compute we expect to track hardware over time. These ratings, these properties, these will go up. Now, if the only thing these cores could be used for were running parachains pretty much exactly as parachains were running today, then this would be a bit of a dry talk. But it turns out that there's actually lots of other things you can do with a computer that happens to be ubiquitous, global, and available to everybody. One of the things that we can do is we can actually consider running smart contracts directly on cores. Now, this isn't an especially, this isn't going to be delivered tomorrow, but the idea of it, I think, is a very useful one to move the paradigm, move the perspective, so that we can understand how general these things are. They really are quite general. They don't need to be used to secure parachains. Imagine that you have a piece of logic that needed approximately a Geekbench 5 computer of 380, constantly doing compute on it, and sort of brought in and had a state, let's say, of 2.5 megabytes. So basically had 2.5 megabytes of memory to play around with. You could run this on a core, you know? And this allows you, this Geekbench score and this bandwidth is far more substantial than what you will find in a smart contract chain. And in principle, it probably costs a lot less to do it on Polkadot. And for most sort of alternatives, doing it on Polkadot is way more secure as well. And obviously, you get a lot of added benefits, like the ability to take part in a much wider message passing environment. All right. So what does it mean? What does it mean for like those that are sort of looking at it from a brass tacks point of view? Cores are agile things, right? They're very general. And in principle, they don't deal in terms of like fixed jobs. It's not like a core can only have one thing on it indefinitely. They can change what job they're doing just as easily as a CPU in a modern machine can alter what process it's working on right now. The time slicing is obviously a bit more coarse-grained. Rather than it being on the millisecond level, it's on the second level. But nonetheless, the principle is the same. And when we're talking about things on a very global basis, altering on the second level is actually pretty damn good. If the cores are such agile resources, it only makes sense that the procurement of cores, the procurement of this resource, should be agile as well. And the slot auction model is most certainly not agile. It's designed on the original basis of Polkadot, the original perspective, the original paradigm, long-running single chains. Indeed, it was only some years into the development of Polkadot that parathreads as an idea arose. And even this was only a small portion of the way to the correct, I would say, paradigm, to the paradigm that correctly models, or most closely models, what it is that we've actually built. Now, the problem with the slot auction model and it not being agile is it creates high barriers. It creates high barriers into the Polkadot, into the space of Polkadot, Polka world, whatever you want to call it. These barriers, some of them are merely perceived, but a lot of the time they're actually real barriers. If you have a tinkerer, someone who's, like I used to be and a little bit still am, who's just playing around with some technology, such people, or at least if, placing myself in that particular role, wearing the tinkerer hat, I don't want to be bothered about raising tokens or marketing or finding other people with whom I can. I just want to deploy some code and see if people use it. Kind of like open source approach, right? And by forcing them into this model, I believe we lose a lot of potential collaborators. So I'm going to put forward a possible future agile Polkadot, if you want a name. we depart from the leases and the slots model. And rather, we accept that Polkadot is this bunch of compute cores. Cores in a ubiquitous computer. Time on these cores, which we might reasonably call core time, although across the industry is perhaps also considered block space, can be sold periodically. Periodically, core time can be bought and used. Here's a proposal. To Polkadot native sales, this is Polkadot native in that it's not secondary market, it's primary market. Bulk and instantaneous. Bulk would be a monthly sale, every, say, 4 weeks, periodic, of core time. You buy core time on one core. Lasts 4 weeks. Instantaneous would be similar to what the Parathreads pay-as-you-go model that we said is, now sort of on demand, as the nomenclature has changed, but the principle is the same. There is an instantaneous market for usage of Polkadot, and specifically usage of a core in Polkadot. There may be many cores that you can buy at once, maybe not, who knows. That's the point of the market. It's an ongoing sale of core time for immediate usage. Doing this, we remove a lot of the opinionation that is present within Polkadot, and therefore remove the potential for long-term design flaws. We maximize the agility. We maximize the potential for the market to figure out the details. Take a bit further look into sort of bulk sales. This is the idea of a 4-weekly sale. So 4 weeks of core time at a fixed price. So everyone pays the same price. This is not necessarily a final proposal. This is more something that can be discussed, and if it turns out to be a good idea, which I suspect it might, implemented. Relatively easily, I might add. We might target 75% of available cores, maybe less, maybe more, who knows, some amount. The price would adapt up and down depending on the deviation from this amount, and unrented cores would go to the instantaneous market. They'd sort of fall down, and they could be rented on an instantaneous, on an immediate basis. Very importantly, special considerations, I imagine, would be necessary for pre-existing tenants. And this is something that I would talk about in a second. Talk about the instantaneous sales briefly. Instantaneous sales is basically cores that are otherwise unused. They go into a sort of market maker or brokerage, on-chain, of course. Regulates the price, targets 100% usage of cores, and core time could be taken from the bulk market, sliced up, and partially placed in the instantaneous brokerage. And then, of course, the total sale revenue that the instantaneous brokerage gets would be split between those who provide their core time, not least the Polkadot network itself. Let's talk about the nature of this things. Purchased by chains through collators, pretty easy so far. It could be used to boost transaction throughput. You get an extra core, you can do twice as much processing, more or less. It can also be used to reduce latency. If the chain is only ticking along at 12 or 18 seconds, you have an extra core, you can now tick along at 6 seconds or 12 seconds for a period. It could also, in principle, power other things, more exotic things than parachains, like core contracts. Let's talk about bulk core time, the nature of bulk core time. Now, this would be a concept exposed by potentially some particular parachain, a brokerage parachain. Now, the fun thing about bulk core time is that it's an asset. It doesn't need to be deployed directly. It doesn't need to be assigned directly. And because it's an asset, it can be used in the same way that other assets are used. It's a non-fungible asset, pretty much. I mean, it's fungible if it's literally for the same time period. But as soon as it gets sliced up, it becomes a non-fungible asset. And this non-fungible asset, in principle, can be exposed over XCM, which essentially means the brokerage can expose these purchased amounts of bulk core time to other chains that may want to allow them to be exchanged, traded on their markets. And this brokerage parachain, system parachain, can allow these chunks, which initially will be sold in 4-week periods, to be split up into multiple NFTs of smaller periods. And these chunks of core time could be consumed by the broker parachain in order to allow the owner to allocate computation on a Polkadot core. How would you use these things once they're consumed? You could assign it to a single parachain. This is exactly what is happening right now, except it doesn't happen month by month. But a single parachain operates on a single core. It could be assigned to a number of parachains for them to share, taking turns on a core. It could be placed on the instantaneous market. Or it could be carved up and sold separately, maybe on a separate parachain even, through the NFT XCM interface. Well, that's all very good, but what if you want to exist on a core for a long time? Surely you need some sort of prediction of what the price is going. I would propose a rule. If you assign a fresh month of core time, when I say fresh, I mean directly having been purchased from Polkadot, then the brokerage records the price that was paid and the assignment, the para ID or para IDs, it was assigned to. It records this for next month. And there is always an option of next month, the same purchaser paying the same or similar, maybe there's a capped price increase, for, amount of core time for the same assignment. This means that long-running assignments are able to clearly make predictions on their exposure, their price exposure, their costs. What does it mean for existing parachains in this model? Well, leases would continue as usual, right? It's like if you've already got a 2-year lease, it continues, no problem. Bulk pricing would be initialized by governance. I think, personally, it should start pretty low in order to minimize the barriers to entry. And then for the right of first refusal, rent controls would be in place and a floor price for the main price. And this would give long-term guarantees on the price paid and of guaranteeing slot availability. Potentially much more so than we have at present, where it's really only a 2-year guarantee. In principle, you would have clarity over indefinite future. What else does it mean? Well, at the moment, parachains have an essentially fixed block production rate. It's currently 12 seconds, pretty much, and it could be reduced to 6 seconds with a certain optimization that is hitting the ground soon. But in the future, it's much more likely that parachains, I think, will be more agile in terms of how often they produce blocks. It could easily be that a parachain shares a core with 1 or 2 other parachains, having a block every 12 seconds or 18 seconds. And then, if and when the transaction throughput of the parachain requires it, the parachain automatically goes to the instantaneous market, or perhaps even an OTC market that exists on some enterprising parachain somewhere, to purchase additional core time. It would be the job of Cumulus to ensure that all core time purchased for a parachain is adequately utilized in an automatic fashion. Core time, when you have your cores, could in principle be what I've called compressed. This is not especially final terminology. In order to essentially combine multiple parachain blocks into the same relay chain core. And this would reduce the latency, although it would cost a bit in terms of bandwidth, because you're basically having to pay for the fixed price of opening and closing a block. Or they could be combined. So you can take 2 cores that are existing at the same time slot and actually get 2 full parachain blocks through, effectively reducing a parachain's time from 12 seconds to 6, or even from 6 seconds to 3. What this actually means in total is more transaction bandwidth when you need it, lower costs if you don't need it, potential for high-performance multi-core chains, chains that operate for a continuous period at a lower block rate, a lower block period, a faster block rate. Potential for periodic chains, chains that sort of come alive, are very active for a while and then drop down again. Potentially for purely pay-as-you-go chains, chains that operate only when users who want to transact have transactions waiting. Potential for low latency chains, chains that produce blocks every 2 seconds, even less, even every 1 second, and maybe don't have a full amount of weight within their blocks, but are able to nonetheless get them pushed through the relay chain, finalized, and messages passed relatively fast. And I think an important point to note is that with the proposal, longer-term capital expenditure planning would be possible. All right, let's look at the cores. How can they be used? Well, core time will be able to be sliced and recombined in a more pictorial fashion. This is what we do at the moment, dumb core usage. Time is going along left to right, and each one of the rows, you can imagine, is a core on Polkadot. At the moment, we have one parachain taking one core. There is the light blue parachain, the green parachain, the orange parachain, the red parachain, and the indigo parachain. Actually, it doesn't matter which core that they're appointed to. This is all irrelevant. So the affinity, as we might call it, which core which parachain operates on, is not important at all. Cores do not have any greater friendliness to one parachain than another. So let's think about agile usage of this resource that we've built, also known as exotic scheduling. Well, ranges can be split. A parachain might have a period from, I don't know, some point to some other point, and then stop being processed, and some other parachain gets processed, some other job, some other thing. Indeed, if we look at the light blue parachain here, it kind of stops and then carries on later. So does the green one. Stops and then carries on over here. Ranges could be strided, basically taking turns. I have a go on a core, you have a go on a core, and so on. It could be that you need 2/3 of the time, so you want an average block time of 9 seconds. That'd be the case with the light blue and the yellow. Could be a time that you only, could be the case that you only need, say, 1/3 of the time, a block every 18 seconds. Similarly, cores could be compressed. Essentially, the same core at the same time could process multiple or secure multiple parachain blocks. Let's think of some more exotic cases. Combine cores. So if the same para ID, the same sort of task, is assigned to multiple cores at the same time, there is a cumulus can be built so that it can use both cores and actually process 2 parachain blocks within this core, within this period. Here you can see orange has a permanent core assignment, but also has some intermittent core assignment as well. And you can see light red has an intermittent core assignment, and then occasionally has some extra cores to sort of tide it over, presumably in a period of high transaction throughput. Future directions on this could be even sharing the same core at the same time between 2 different parachains. Maybe even more, maybe 3. This is a little bit trickier. And in principle, this could all be composable. You can put it all together and have an extremely agile, ubiquitous compute resource. All right. The talk is split into roughly 3 segments. That's the first segment. Essentially trying to alter the perspective on what it is that Polkadot is doing, from being one that's centered around chains to one that's being centered around the actual resource that it's providing, which is these cores. The next thing I want to talk about, which is in the same vein, it's still sort of trying to move away from chain centricity, is turning Polkadot into something that is more application centric. So Polkadot 1, it was a very chain-centric paradigm. The idea was that there were isolated chains, these parachains. They're able to exchange messages with each other. They can talk to each other. It's not dramatically, as in terms of a model, it's not dramatically dissimilar to having just completely separate chains that have bridges built between each other, right? The main difference is that there's like this blob in the middle called the relay chain. And if you come at it from that perspective, you miss a lot of the value of Polkadot. This results in fragmented user experiences. User may be using an app on one chain that sort of wants to use an app on another chain in this kind of multi-chain way. But if the paradigm is one that is very chain-centric, we end up with chain-centric user experience. And if the application is not chain-centric, everything becomes very difficult. In reality, if we're going to use Polkadot's potential, apps need to span across chains. And that when they do, this needs to be seamless from the point of view at least of the user, and ideally of the developer. So here is my artist impression of what Polkadot sort of is considered. Now, one area that we have strayed into for the desire to launch fast, get something out the door, was to host a lot of the application capability of Polkadot on the relay chain. Now, this had trade-offs. Obviously, it allowed us to deliver a lot of functionality relatively quick, before the full technology base was properly completed. It allowed us to deliver quite an impressive staking system, quite an impressive governance system, tokens, identity. But it came with a cost. If everything is bundled up onto one chain, we have a couple of problems. One of them is that the chain isn't dedicating all of its resources to doing what it's really meant to be doing, which is securing the network and ensuring messages get through. And the other thing is it lures people into a very chain-centric mentality. It used to be possible to only look at one chain in order to deliver the whole gamut of Polkadot's functionality. At launch, everything existed on the relay chain, and that was what was targeted. And unfortunately, the tooling has not fully moved into the world where applications and users exist across chains. Now, system features are moving into this across-chain spanning paradigm. Yeah? As you see a predominance of system chains and increasingly fewer things handled on the relay chain, that is what is happening. And apps need to be able to span these chains. And for that matter, the user experience must not be made difficult by this. This is an artist impression, artistically drawn by me about half an hour ago, on what I think a better viewpoint on what Polkadot is should be, how it should be presented. Polkadot is not a relay chain in the middle and parachains on the outside, or at least it should not be from the perspective of anyone coming to Polkadot. In reality, Polkadot should be an integrated system, a single computer on which many applications run. Now, yes, there are important boundaries between the different components, the different business logic components of the chain that we call, roughly speaking, parachains. But this isn't so important to the user as we might accidentally think it is. What is more important is that what the user wants to do, they are able to do easily, transparently, quickly. The blobs here, the dots, are these applications, if you like. And the little dotted lines that break up this are, if you like, the paras. I don't want to say parachains, because that goads us into this kind of tunnel vision of one core per parachain, which is what Polkadot has been so far, but is not necessarily what it needs to be. These little blobs, if we do it right, should be able to interact with each other almost as easily if they're within the same dotted line segment as if they are not within the same dotted line segment. I say almost. We're never going to get, I don't think, to a point where it is exactly as easily. But we can make it quite similar. How are we going to do that? Let's talk about XCM. XCM is a language. If you want the transport layer, the thing that actually delivers the message, that's called XCMP. Questionable naming, I agree. What's XCM meant to do? Well, it's meant to abstract over functionality that is common within chains. It creates an expressive language of what you intend to do or what you want to happen. As long as chains faithfully interpret this message, it's all good. Unfortunately, there are no guarantees that a chain will faithfully interpret your XCM message. XCM is not ideal if we are in a trustless environment. If we take the, thanks to Rob for reminding me of this analogy. In the world of trading, what we might say that XCMP, this transportation method, gives us a secure trade route. We're not going to get robbed on the way, right? Anything that is sent is going to arrive. However, it doesn't give us a framework for creating binding agreements between the different trading outposts. Taken another way, we might compare it to a more immediate thing, the European Union, right? Interesting, large-scale social experiment. Now, what is it? Well, what is it? Basically, it's a union. You can join it. It's basically a treaty framework, in essence. It holds different sovereign nations to a particular agreement to basically work together and keep certain laws in line. But it's not perfect. It's not a perfect implementation of this. Why not? Essentially because while there is a common judiciary that can interpret each country's laws in a way that ensures that they are being followed according to the law as stated by the country, it doesn't necessarily prevent a country from altering its laws in a way that is not concordant with the overall expectations of being within the European Union. Well, in Polkadot, we kind of have a similar problem. XCM is a language expressing intent, and we have WebAssembly as a way of essentially expressing the law that a parachain holds itself to. And by being within Polkadot, Polkadot holds it to that very law. It's essentially kind of, you can think of it as an ECJ or something, European Court of Justice, right? It's a court, a way of ensuring parachains are held to the logic that they propose to be held to. But it doesn't mean that that logic cannot be changed legitimately by the parachain in such a way that makes it dishonor XCM, dishonor the language, even if in the past it did honor it. XCM is a language of intention. I intend to transfer assets. I intend to vote. Now, between system chains that trust each other, it's not a big problem. But if they're under different governance processes, different legislative assemblies, we do have an issue. And we can do so much better in the world of Polkadot. Accords. It's a new term. I think it's a long time coming. An accord could be considered to be an opt-in treaty between, across many chains. It's kind of like saying, I want to hold myself to this business logic. I agree to be held to this bit of business logic, and nothing that I can do can prevent that. Treaty logic can't be undermined by the chain itself. It can't be changed by the chain itself. Polkadot guarantees faithful execution of this logic. That's part of the Polkadot deal. Now, the accord would be specific to a particular function. Any chain that entered the accord would be held to it, and it would service this particular function. And to keep barrier to entry low, accords are permissionally proposable. But because they're, of course, opt-in, it doesn't affect anyone until they actually agree and sign up to the accord. Now, this, I'm afraid, is not my very best artistic impression. But if you imagine you take the Polkadot, the circle of Polkadot that has all these dots on it, and you kind of flip it so it's horizontal now, one can imagine accords as being things that actually come off the disk and have a separate mechanism that overrules their local sovereignty. And you can call this accord space. Now, accords can't exist on just any kind of system. In fact, as far as I know, Polkadot would be the only system that they can properly exist on, because it's the only system that has a homogeneous security layer, but which also provides a specific state transition function for each of its shards. And this allows patterns of cooperation, patterns of what we might call kind of trans-application functionality that are just impossible to do over bridges. They're impossible to do over this a little blob with a communication channel to another little blob. They're a fundamental new primitive. Now, those who have followed Polkadot for a bit probably might have heard the term spree being bandied about. Well, spree is the technology with which we can implement accords. Let's think of some accords that might make sense. One of them would be an asset hub, right? At the moment, if two chains want to have asset interactions, they kind of have to go through a third chain. They have to go through this asset hub chain. Now, if one of them is the native chain for the asset, it's a little bit different. But in principle, if two chains that are unrelated do want to deal in a third asset, you kind of have to have this additional path. Well, accords remove all of that. Essentially, you can think of it as almost like an embassy, something that exists within the general process space. It's scheduled on the same core at the same time as the parachain, but it's not part of the parachain's business logic. It's an extra thing. Kind of like embassies have their own law that is in line with the country that they are the embassy of, yet they sit physically in the local country. So it's similar with accords. It's kind of like business logic that is, in principle, foreign, but agreed upon. And it exists locally. You can also imagine a multicast XCM router, the ability to send a single message, but for it to go across into multiple chains. Maybe in an ordered fashion. So do this operation here, and then carry on and do that operation there, but still with my permission, still with my privilege. Can't do that at the moment. We can imagine things like a decentralized exchange that has outposts across many different chains. So the exchange can be used locally without having to have a bidirectional channel open. And this is just what I think off the top of my head. I am sure over time the technology will be used and see its full potential. Let's move into the user interface space. Project Cappy. This is a means of, or it's designed, I should say, intended to be a means of ensuring that Polkadot-based applications that span multiple chains are able to have a fluid and a seamless interface, even when using light clients. Moving everything from the relay chain into system chains, multiple system chains, is no small task. But this is nonetheless the direction that needs to be walked in. And when this happens, we will move increasingly into this pan-chain, multi-chain application paradigm. Good. Now, the final part of the talk is I want to briefly explain what it is and restate what it is that we are, what we're building, why we're building it. This is about resilience. World changes, but if people have stated intention, it's important that those intentions are be held to. It's important that the systems keep systems in check. We need to create this kind of world of resilience. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. The systems that we have at present are really not very resilient. They're based upon old school thinking. Now, I think I would expect most of the people here are sort of familiar with this kind of approach: decentralization, cryptography, game theory. This is an example of what happens when you don't have decentralization, cryptography, and game theory in your system. Things break. In this case, colossal cyber attack. And this happens all too often. Various personal details of about 6 million people. 6 million people, right? One in 1,000 globally were doxed, right? And what does this cost people? Huge amounts of time, stress, effort, energy. Expand this to the world. And all too often it feels like we're treading water. So how do we build resilience into the systems that increasingly are needed to live in this world? Well, obviously, building systems that are decentralized, that are based on cryptography, that are game theoretically sound is a really good start. But what specifically are we trying to do? Well, preponderance of light client usage would be a really good starting point. At the moment, it's all too centralized. We preach decentralization, but are we really building a resilient system if everything goes through the single RPC provider? No, not really. Light client usage must become part and parcel of the experience. Some of the more recent advances in cryptography give us important primitives in order to take what we're doing forward and ensuring that we can actually build effective, resilient systems. More different consensus algorithms, improved consensus algorithms, the same. And a few other points. Let's talk a little about the light client usage. Part of Cappy's, Project Cappy, which is essentially middleware, allowing Polkadot applications to be built. Cappy's main reason for existence, if you like, is to demonstrate light client usage is not only possible, it's practical. It's even preferable. Zero-knowledge primitives. Great show, this. Recommend watching it if you can. Father Ted. Now, there are different usages of the various ZK technology that has come up over the last 5 or so years. Some of it, I think, is probably not such a great idea in that it can lead, while it's kind of interesting in and of itself, it can have a very problematic effect on censorship resistance, part of building a resilient platform, and centralization. In particular, having huge state transition functions be boiled down into a single proof of correct execution is not at present an effective scaling solution if we want to build resilient systems. However, ZK primitives are very interesting to be for interesting possibilities for immediate usage in smaller, well-measured portions. And what I'm interested in doing, and indeed what has already started to have been done within the Polkadot developer and researcher ecosystem, is building a library of these primitives that are ready to go for specific use cases, specific things that we want to do when we build applications. The first is almost completed, I'm told. Provided it provides privacy, and it will be used very immediately in on-chain collectives. And this allows us to bring reusable modules into the world of zero knowledge and privacy protection. Let's talk a little about the upcoming consensus mechanism, Sassafras. This is notably different to Babe because it is forkless. Basically, blocks are not produced unless they are expected to be finalized, which is not what it is at present. This improves certain things, purely on the basis of it being forkless, like security. It gives us high-performance transaction routing. It's not that we know exactly who to send a transaction to, but we can come very close. Transactions can be gotten to their eventual includer within just one hop. Unlike at present, where it's all very much gossiped and not especially efficient. Forklessness improves parachain performance and user experience. We have the potential to do quite clever things, like encrypting transactions. So those, apart from the final includer, can't actually see what it is. With this, together with the high-performance transaction routing, helps prevent front-running. And there are also some interesting avenues opened up that could benefit resilience against minor extracted value, validator extracted value, really. Let's go on. The internode mixnet, something that is coming to Substrate very soon. This is essentially a shielded transport protocol for short messages, things like transactions. Avoids leaking IP information. Again, crucial if we are to build a resilient system. It also introduces some general messaging system, allowing users, chains, and off-chain workers, and anything that exists within a chain, smart contracts, pallets, to exchange messages. These messages can contain things like signatures, intentions, advertisements, whatever you want. They can also be human readable. Finally, I want to touch on a very crucial element in building resilience, which is human decentralization. There need to be a lot of people. It doesn't matter how decentralized the technology is, or how resilient and game theoretically sound, if there is only one person involved in it, it will not be resilient. And a lot of this is about building the right structures, the right ways of getting people in and allowing everyone to contribute towards bringing the system overall forward in the benefit of, one would hope, at least those who are a part of it, and ideally the world as well. Part of this is what we've loosely termed governance, and governance by now is moving very much in a sort of DAO direction, right? If you look at what Polkadot governance is at the moment, it's a lot more than just token holders do a vote on things now and again. Spending, salaries, grants, wealth management. There is wealth here, but it needs to be directed to the right things. And involving as many people as possible ensures there is resilience against that spending becoming systemically misjudged. Ensuring that the expertise that the maintenance of the system relies upon is retained and incentivized is also a crucial way of decentralizing the network. Experts, whether they're researchers, maintainers, implementers, or indeed anyone else involved, need to be bolstered, they need to be incentivized, they need to be recruited over time. And it is ultimately the Polkadot network which must do that, not any specific organization within the Polkadot ecosystem. And there are, I think, very interesting and important elements that can be solved effectively by having many individuals involved, such as oracleization and administrative affairs. And I just want to end on trying to restate what it is that we're here for. We're not here to build, specific applications, or at least Polkadot is not here for one specific application. Polkadot is here to provide a platform and provide a means of deploying multiple applications within the same environment and having the applications be able to utilize each other for the overall benefit of the user base. And ensuring that happens as effectively as possible, I would say, is really the job of those behind Polkadot. And there is very little point in building Polkadot if it is not resilient to changes in the world, be they alternatives of ways of doing roughly the same thing, or existential threats coming from organizations, external organizations that aren't especially happy with the idea of a trust-free world. This is simply the same resilience, but applied to different potential threats. Good. That's what I've come here to say, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you.